Yeah, I find that with architects, we have a lot of terminology that is already there and is already useful.
Hmm.
Architects think in terms of shape a lot.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think we can talk about acoustics in that realm really
Hmm.
without much new language at all. They
Hmm.
just need to be brought on board in the same way that we just discussed. Like we need to clarify what we mean by material, or
Hmm.
maybe
Hmm.
give it a new definition and say that when I say material, I'm talking about the substance from which things are made,
Hmm. Hmm.
and to point out that that the acoustic value or acoustic behavior of something is inherently related to how it's shaped, because that's always not necessarily something that they have been taught. We are taught that polished stone is bad acoustically, but if
Hmm.
you were to do a complex enough polished stone sculptural wall, it would absolutely be diffusive, and you could probably even get it to absorb if you did the right things. And I think once we have that common understanding that
Hmm.
we're talking about material in a certain way and shape in a certain way,
Hmm.
then the design possibilities just really open up.
Zackery Belanger is an expert in the form and material of acoustic architecture. For most of his career, he has questioned the dominant approaches in acoustics, convinced that intuitive, creative approaches are possible. He is the author of the essay Acoustic Ornament, which argues for consideration of non-acoustic surfaces and objects. In 2017, he founded the Detroit-based studio Arcgeometer. Belanger is a prolific speaker on acoustics and has worked extensively on architectural projects and products. Well, hey, Zach. It's great to see you again. How are you today?
Hi, Jamie. Pretty good.
Yeah.
Pretty good. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So I was just commenting on your reverberous space there, and I love your perspective on that. You know,
Yeah. Yeah. This is my studio in Detroit, and it is pretty reverberant, and I actually prefer it that way. I like I like the way it gives back to me when I talk. It reminds me that
yeah,
it's here, and it's also kind of nice to have finally in my career a space that's large enough to have reverberation like this. Honestly,
sure, yeah, reminds you of your success, some grandeur in your
yeah,
life.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
The
you
small
know
thing.
what? Interesting. I curate a part of the NAM show, the large, the big musical instrument trade show every year. And this year I elevated what are simply black curtains. We don't have a closed-in space, but I took those elevations from 8 feet to 10 feet, just and put in overhead lighting to give us more of a sense of grandeur. There's something
Mm.
about elevation in large spaces which we react to differently as humans. It gives a sense of. Oh, now I'm thinking about it though. I wonder if that's just us North Americans who are used to tiny boxes. I wonder if the Europeans feel the same way,
I
who
don't
are
know.
used to higher
It's a
ceilings
good
and such.
question. But I know that there is a relationship for me with possibility, large spaces, and the notion of possibility. Things feel more possible in a space this size.
Hmm.
And when we're dealing with architecture, there's always an issue of scale too. So it is hard for me to work on large spaces from in a tiny office, for example, and just imagining everything. And the idea with this space is that it's more of a studio, less of an office. You could
Hmm.
build prototypes here if you wanted. You could
Hmm.
deploy things at a larger scale. And I think, yeah, there is a sense of grandeur maybe about it, but it also
Hmm.
feels more connected to the type of spaces that we work on.
Hmm. Hmm. So, so, so when you're dealing with something on a larger scale, do you find you have to leave even your studio? What do you do? Do you get outside? Do you get into a larger building? How do you get yourself in the right
That's a
headspace?
good question. Yeah, I try to pay attention to every space that I'm in, and I think that builds a lot of. It almost builds like a database, a mental database in my head, because you can't. There's a lot of architecture, of course, that happens before the building is built. You have to extrapolate to that, and
Hmm.
so that's a good question. I don't know that there's ever a way to really solve it. If you're working on, let's say, the shape of a particular surface, you have to have some idea about how that is going to influence the bigger space. That bigger
Hmm.
space could be a long way away. It could not even exist yet. You may just not have access to it. So I think it's an ongoing challenge. And I think that the nice thing is that as we move through the world, we're able to experience so many different spaces that we end up getting a fairly good sense for what they are like to be
Sure.
in. And I think that's really helpful.
Yeah. At this stage in evolution, anyways.
Yeah.
I wonder
Yeah.
if you think back to early architects and early structural designers, about that sense of space and how different that sense of space might have been for them, to create something that's so different than what they experience in the natural world. Maybe it happened over such a long period of time that it wasn't such an issue, but
Yeah, that's right. I think a long time ago, right, that was always looming, the fact that buildings took so long to build, at least the large ones. And, it might be the one thing you did over your life, and it might not be done when you're
yes.
finally gone. It might be carried on by others.
Yeah, my son, who's doing the technical work on this, Zach, he lives in Strasbourg, France, and the cathedral in Strasbourg was centuries of construction. It's a Roman city there, and I think that there are churches. Well, as a matter of fact, in a more recent example, isn't Barcelona about to celebrate the completion of the Gaudi Cathedral after more than 100 years of construction?
Yeah, I think that's right. The Sagrada Familia, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, and we don't
I've only
think
seen it
on
with
those
scaffolding. I've never seen it finished. Right.
Yeah. And I think thinking on that time scale is important, and I don't think we do much of that anymore. I mean, a lot of architecture is driven by profit, so you want to get it done fast, you want to get it done cheap, you want to if there's a better idea that comes along, meaning a more profitable one, you want to be able to undo what you did and redo it. And yeah, I wish we could think more on century long scales, because the work, I think, has a deeper meaning when you're thinking about it being used by many generations, to a point where again, you may not even see the completion of it. I think there's something really beautiful in that if we're trying to make things that are meant to last well beyond our time here, that's a really beautiful idea.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps that's one of those. Yeah, one of those things that happens with our current system of government, and I guess the monarchies allowed for a sense of legacy and a sense of many of the kings and queens of the past would try and build frankly, a monument to themselves or a monument to their period anyways. And famously almost, bankrupt countries like France for all the money they spent on building grand structures to their own image, right? And there were revolutions that happened as a result of it. But that's a different sense of economy, of finances. And I'd never thought about the idea that post-monarchies, when there's not one person deciding to build a grand structure, that something like architecture and the idea of delayed gratification to leaving a legacy and creating something beautiful might have suffered, actually, in that transition.
Maybe, but I don't think it's impossible to do it, right? We might just need to shift our thinking a little. I don't think it's impossible to do it in a more democratic society.
Yeah.
But we are also a fairly young country. Maybe that has something to do with it, the United States. And, but we appreciate architecture from the past. It just takes a while, I think, for us to connect that appreciation with a sense that we can also make the architecture of the past for future generations. And that it really shouldn't come down to whether you have a plan to make money on it right now. One of the earlier projects I worked on in acoustics was a St. Luke's Cathedral in London, and it was made into a rehearsal space for the London Symphony Orchestra. This was back when I was at a firm called Kierkegaard Associates out of Chicago. But if I recall, the church was built in the early 1700s, and it had sat vacant for decades before they found this use for it. And it was wonderful that they didn't tear it down just because they weren't sure what its purpose was for a few decades.
Yes.
And that made it available for this now beautiful use. And I think the LSO signed a 100-year lease on it or something like that. It's
Right.
a glorious space. It's a lovely space, and it was worth waiting for. But I do sometimes think that in the States we might have torn that building down in an eagerness
Yeah.
to do something productive immediately with that property.
Well, there's so many things in that little story that, for me, I think it's fascinating because the symphony orchestra is at the point where it is sort of enshrined and iconic at this point. It really is a culture which is not really growing and creating new things so much. It's a historical reenactment, and really there are sort of the saints of that sort of period. I think there's a statistic that I believe is something like 90 or 95% of all music played in symphony orchestras around the world is from about 3 to 4 composers. Those sort of great saints of
Wow.
the world. And so it's quite fitting that an institution which has become so iconic and somewhat enshrined would be the right people to take over a place like St.
Yeah.
Luke's.
Maybe
That's
so. And I know that I'm not an expert in classical music world, but I do know that there's activity, at least here in Detroit, and I'm sure elsewhere, to try to adapt and evolve. I recently went to a screening of Black Panther at the Detroit Symphony with the
yes,
Detroit Symphony Orchestra playing a live accompaniment, and
yeah,
it was an absolute blast.
yeah,
And so I don't know what the answer is, but I know I know that they are working toward bringing in the younger generation. And I guess they have to think along these longer
they
scales, right?
do.
It's an organization that has been around for a long time, and they can't just rely on the people who have been a part of it for decades. They need to reach out to the younger generation too.
Yeah, I mean, with symphony music, we're so far past the point of its uber creative period. And please, I don't mean this in any negative way, but there's every major movement is the exploration of ideas. And so we explore those ideas. We make structures with those ideas. We make music with those ideas, and poetry and movies. But eventually, we've said pretty much all there is that can be said on that particular topic, and we close up that body of work. One might call an oeuvre in the artistic sense, and we explore new ideas. And there's nothing really wrong with that. It doesn't make that previous idea irrelevant. It just means it's being explored at great depth. And so we move from, Nouveau to Deco to Cubism, whatever it happens to be. And musically we do it, and I presume architecturally we do it as well. We revisit ideas because they've become icons. You look at your capital in the United States of Washington. They hired a French architect, and there's Greco-Roman columns on the White House. It has nothing to do with the history of the U.S. Well, I mean, it does as immigrants, but those were meant to give a sense of history when there was no history, right? So we riff on those icons, and yeah. So I don't mean it in a negative way to say that we're not really doing new things. Of course, you can write a new song on instruments from the symphony orchestra, and you can experience things like you did with Black Panther. I recently had a friend experience the same thing with the Lord of the Rings in Toronto, where they watched the film to live music with the TSO, and so those are still cherished expressions, and that's why we reenact them. But there is a funneling effect that goes from this period of exploration where it consumes society, and as we sort of resolve the conversation, we sort of narrow it down into sort of we conserve ideas and we refine ideas, and then we sort of create the icons and we make sort of saints of these people somewhat, and then we have this hero and the icon, and then we move into a period of reenactment and exploitation of the hero and of the icon. And then in the marketplace, which I'll sort of try and thread the needle on this part of the conversation, in the economic sense, we end up with cheap renderings of the icon, which give us the sort of feeling of it, and then we have highly valuable actual realized things that stay true to what the icon is. And so in the sense of my daily work, which is in the boutique guitar industry, there are lots of people who say, well, why would you spend 10 or 20 or $30,000 or more on a guitar when you can buy a perfectly fine guitar for $500. And it's that conversation about value and how you value something and what it is you're valuing about it. Do you value, not that you can't get a good guitar at $500, I don't mean that, and not that you can't build a good structure cheaply, but we imbue deeper meaning and value into certain things, and some of it's through the process. Some of it's the value of building it over multiple generations, over hundreds of years. Some of it is, luxury is defined by the unnecessary, isn't it? There's a utilitarian approach, and then there's the unnecessary. And unnecessary, frankly, is luxury. That's how it's literally defined. And so, anyways, to bring all this back into mind, one of the things I'm struck with our conversation here, which I'm enjoying so much about it, Zackery, and your perspective, is one of my heroes as a thought leader and as an artist, but mainly as a thought leader, frankly, is Konstantin Brancusi. And I have a few quotes on my wall. One of them is that things are not difficult to make. What is difficult is putting ourselves in the state of mind to make them. And I talk about that every single day with what we do, and I constantly try and remind myself of that, and that, from just how I get up in the morning. Taking the time to read a chapter of a book before I just get to my office, because I work from home, and so it's very easy for me to just get to the office, and not feed my mind with new ideas, take walks to get myself into the headspace to have good conversations and good meetings. Yeah. Because I'm a creative like you, and I'm effectively employed because of my perspective and how we find solutions to problems, which is, so you have to really be mindful, and you seem to be very, very mindful, and right down to the choice of how you do it. I do the same thing, by the way. Do it. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, I do the same thing, by the way. I try to read 10 pages in a book every morning, and it's not an acoustics book. I try to do this because it enriches my thinking. It keeps me open to ideas from the outside world, and I find that even if it's not directly related, it somehow finds its way into the day, into the work.
Yeah. 10 pages, eh?
10 pages. Yeah. I mean, it's a moving target. Sometimes I go a little less, sometimes a little more, depending on the book. But I have to have some kind of a goal to stick with.
I'm such a slow reader. If it's a good book. Because if it's a good book, I literally stop. I'll look up a word if I don't know it. I have to keep my phone beside me because I look it up. I want to know it. I don't want to just brush past it, right? So I want to know the word. I want to understand exactly what they're saying. Then I'll often take a picture of the paragraph. I'll highlight a section, send it to myself as an email. Almost anything that I think is a good book is also a study. And so sometimes, one chapter, can be 3 pages, but it's so profound. I don't want to rush into the next chapter, It's like a good glass of wine. Reader. You shouldn't want to take the next sip so fast, right? Yeah. You linger on it.
Yeah, because you're trying to pull the content from it. You're trying to understand the content. Yes. You're not just trying to get through a book. I studied physics originally, and I learned to read doing that. And you had to read and reread and reread and look up every word. And I find that to be helpful, but I do take a very long time to get through every single book I pick up.
Yeah.
That's just the speed I go at.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Let's talk about that physics and acoustics designs. And I'm super excited to talk to you about a few things. But rather than jump into my assumptions about what you're doing, do you want to just sort of give me? We've only, I don't even know if we interacted. We were on panels together for the Venice Biennale, right. But I don't know that you and I have even said hello at some point in time before this.
Yeah, so this is a great opportunity. I'm glad to be here. So do you want the overview of what I do?
What are you up to today? And is there something that you are just that you're excited about, that you want to be talking about right now? And then I'll ask you some questions later on that I am curious about with your work, based on the Biennale and things you said then. And so,
yeah, great. Let's see, what am I working on? Well, I think the longer trajectory of my career involved a few different stages. The first would have been a deep immersion into physics. That's my education. I studied general physics as an undergrad and gravitational physics as a master's student, and then made a turn and went into architecture. And so the next phase was I ended up in acoustics, working for a consulting firm out of Chicago, and that phase took about 10 years, where I learned a lot about architecture and acoustics and really how buildings get made. Because that is something we absolutely did not learn in physics. So the first stage was deep education physics. The second stage would have been really a deep experience, I would say, in the real world of getting buildings made. And then the third stage was about the last 10 years, which was really a rethinking of all of that. I left that job. I went and hid in upstate New York for a while and really just questioned a lot about what we do in acoustics, how we do it, where the missing pieces might be. And so now I feel like I'm entering the fourth stage. I'm leaving that other stage behind, and I'm really putting together the type of business and the type of work that I think we should be doing. And so in very particular, to get very particular about it, I believe that we can design our spaces to sound the way we want to acoustically, using really any material, as long as we know how to shape that material at all scales. And this is an idea that really came out of the first three stages I just described. And now the goal is to make it real. And so the thing that gets me excited every day is, how do you build a business on this different way of thinking? Because this is a very different way of thinking than what the acoustics community currently practices, let's say. I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I will say that acoustics is established at this point, architectural acoustics, and there are methods and procedures and structures and businesses and all of that. And all I can say is that the way I have come to think about it is, I think, fundamentally different from those, not necessarily better, but I think there's room for it. And so that's the exciting thing. I think a lot about how do you shape whatever material is in front of you to get a particular acoustic influence from it. And I'm excited about the next 10 years because I'm hoping I get more of a chance to do that.
Well, that's great, because that's the thing that I found most exciting about your work and what you presented at the Biennale was exactly that. And you know, it's in the moment, because I was one of the, you know, Ed Keller and I, we co-hosted the event, we put it together. I don't think I want to do that in the future with panels, because I can't engage in the panel in the same way. I'm thinking about all the technical stuff. And so I really understood what you were saying afterwards, to be honest, to watch it. I watched the video afterwards, and I wish I had been able to engage in it, because I would have had a lot of questions for you at the time. And so it's that exact work, because I have already been on a mission, and it's actually the core reason that we did that symposium was around materiality, because I work with instrument makers, and I work with primarily guitar makers, although I have worked with drum and cymbal makers and a few others as well, but primarily instrument makers, where there's a lot of history there, but there's not a lot of science. And I don't mean this in any sort of negative way. We have masters of what they do who, through empirical experience, that they know when they do this, they get more low frequency. They know when they do this, they get a faster response and such. But the language around it, that language is mostly sort of a localized language that they have through their own experience. They try and explain what is happening. But that story, that narrative differs with every single person you talk to. And so even all of the old masters who have been talking together for years, you know, I remember going to see one of them the next morning. I got in a car with a different guitar maker, and we were driving towards breakfast, and I told him what the guy had told me the day before, and he laughed and said, oh, I love Richard, and and that meant that's not how it is at all, and that's how these conversations go, but there's not a unified effort to come together and develop a lexicon, to develop a common set of terms and understanding. And although there are some people who are writing books on it and such, but through all of these many conversations that I've been having with them, because they don't view me as a guitar maker, I can speak with them differently. And I've spoken with hundreds, maybe thousands of guitar makers at this point in time. And I've recognized that this is, well, none of them see it the same way. And therefore, I'm looking for truth. My basic MO is as a truth seeker. And, well, to not overuse Brancusi, but my way of understanding truth is probably his most famous saying, that simplicity is complexity resolved. And so I go about trying to resolve complex situations all the time to the simplest form that I can think of. And we'll get more into that later on, because I've been trying to boil sound down to its most simplest form that I can understand, and then communicate so that we're not limited by techniques and by the things that we've done before in the past. I'm looking for greater understanding, which is somehow broader and deeper without specificity in the exact same way. Because I find many people get caught up a little bit too much in the techniques of it, which is, I sensed a bit of that when you talked about acoustic materials. Oh, if you have a problem with too much bass in your studio, the answer is buy this foam. And that's the solution. Right. Yeah. And then you showed all of these other architectural solutions in your presentation. And one of the ones that struck me the most was the art gallery in Richmond, Virginia, where it was primarily an open room. And they had changed the angle on one of the long walls, a few of them. So it has a bit of a shingle-like effect or scaling-like effect. Opened up the roof so that exposed the wood, and then the minutia of one of the techniques blew my mind, and I would love to explore that a little bit more with you. And that was the sandblasting of the wooden beams in the roof structure to expose the porosity of it. And you had mentioned that. Do I have a? No, I don't. It's okay. But the point is, you had talked about the porosity being one of those things that led to it. And I wondered about the scale of that, because I have had conversations where an instrument maker will make a high gloss finish, which is typically hard and buffed down, and then they'll make what they call a semi-gloss finish from the same finish, but they're not buffing it. And they tell me, "Oh, you can't hear the difference," and I say, "Oh, that's not true. For me, I get more high end and a faster response on the gloss finish than I do on the semi-gloss finish," and they think I'm nuts. But it's effectively that porosity that you're talking about. When we don't buff the finish, now we don't have the sound coming at it, but there's something happening there. So I'm going to shut up on that for a second and tell me, am I nuts? Tell me how scalable is this idea of porosity with acoustics, and how perceivable is it on the scales?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I want to mention that that idea of resolving complexity is a big driver in this work. And there are a lot of ways you can approach acoustics. And the one that I was immersed in, I think, had a lot to do with learning the techniques, the tools, how do we measure rooms and analyze them and write reports. And I think that what that was always missing for me was a connection, a stronger connection to the architects and to the building owners, because as an expert in a field related to architecture, what the field has always said is you should hire us for your project, essentially, and get us involved, and we will help guide you. And that's a perfectly good way to get a good sounding building. But most architecture doesn't quite work that way. Most projects do not hire acousticians. Most projects don't have the money or the will to do that. And so I was always searching for this, like, what kind of language can we have? Can we develop or use that allows us to bring to the architects and to the building owners an understanding of this stuff so that they can make informed decisions about it. So if you were to spend a week shadowing a typical acoustics consultant, you would find that it's a totally different world. The language they use, the tools they use is very complex. But I want to be able to talk to an architect for 10 minutes and have them leave with a better intuition about how our buildings sound and why, so that they can take that with them. And I think so if we get into something like a porosity, there is a very real physical limitation as to, let's say, what the porosity of something like brick or like wood can do, because there's a limitation to its scale. Sound is very large scale, and you need deep systems to really influence all of the frequencies that matter to us. So I wouldn't say that you can make sure that the porosity of wood is exposed and that you'll never have to reach for an engineered acoustic panel ever again.
Yeah.
But in this particular case, the gallery in Richmond, David Morrison and Claire Accardo were the owners of it. They just had a real interest in architecture and the senses, and they come from the visual art world. They were very interested in the sonic world, and it led to a lot of interesting discussions about what an art gallery is, what it needs to be acoustically and visually, and how those things might overlap. And so something as simple as making sure the wood is exposed and not sealed so that it can do everything it can became an important part of the design of that. And that means that the way I look at it is that if we understand the materials that we make our spaces out of, and we understand how those materials can be shaped and how that shape influences sound, and by shaping, I can mean a fine porosity, then we can start thinking of the room as a whole and not necessarily, and reducing our reliance on additive solutions. Let's put it that way. Because you could certainly just look at a room like that and go, well, nothing in here is absorbing a lot. Let's pile up some acoustic panels. We'll calculate the square footage and we'll make sure that they're 2 or 4 inches deep or whatever, and we'll get enough in there so that we hit a reverberation target and we're good. That's a way you can absolutely do acoustics that way. But I think what we were aiming for is that because there's such a strong visual component to it, they wanted to minimize that kind of intervention. And so we started to ask, what can we do with what we have? The floor, you can't really change the floor. It's glossy, it's flat. What can we do to the walls that keeps them visually simple but helps the room acoustically? What can we do with the wood structure? What happens at the front of the room where a curtain might be brought in? And there was a little bit of let's do everything we can and see how it goes, and you should be prepared because maybe you'll need to add acoustic panels in the end. And in the end they didn't. They actually liked it. And it's a bit reverberant. Something you said earlier about trying not to define too quickly what is good and what is bad. We have absolutely standards. What is the right reverberation time for a podcast? I like to push those boundaries a little bit. Those standards come from somewhere and they make sense for the use of it. But I think they are also limiting, and I don't see the spectrum of reverberation possibility as being good to bad. And I don't see the different uses as always pointing to the same reverberation time. When we think about the project in Richmond, there's a very particular, intelligent, engaged client. They needed to know what the trade-offs were because they wanted to end up with the space that they ultimately dreamed of, not the space that came out of an acoustics book and met the right standards. And so can that space be a bit more reverberant than a typical acoustician was like? Absolutely. But can we get away without using acoustic panels in that case? Yeah, in that case, we could. It all seemed to come together nicely.
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com. There's a response to those acoustics, a physical, emotional response as well, right? Because, when I think about walking around an art gallery, the reverberation that is typical in a gallery causes you to be more self-conscious. It causes you to act more respectfully towards the other people. It causes you to try and not disrupt the environment so much. And so, I don't know, I think that an art gallery should have maybe a heightened level of reverberation, not out of control, right? Especially when you're having an opening or something, you don't want everyone shouting in the space, right? But of course, the bodies will affect that too. But nonetheless, and I was thinking about this when you were talking about spaces earlier on, because I was in our friend in common, Ed Keller, and I had been talking about a church that was built in Longarone, Italy, by Michelucci after a disaster that happened there, where the village was wiped out with a dam disaster that happened. And I went to visit the church, and it's all concrete, and it's made like a shipwright would make it. So they had formed bent boards, and you could see where the boards used to be and such, but this concrete swirling sort of structure internally was extremely reverberant. But then I thought for a moment, as you were talking about your own reverberant space, that, that's interesting, because when all of the people are in it, it would be much less. But the fewer people there are, the more sort of alone with God one might feel. Maybe I'm too romantic. I'm not actually religious.
I think that's
but
right
that
on.
idea.
I think that's right on. And I think that there's this innate connection with the visual realm that we sometimes forget about, and the visual experience. And a lot of architecture is devised for the visual experience. That comes along with a certain acoustic character. And I think it's something that innately should make sense to us, right? And if you're in a large space and the forms are simple around you, we can equate that with a more reverberant space. And if you're in a smaller space that's more ornate, let's say, we equate that with a space that's less reverberant. And I just think there's something that needs to make sense to us innately, that there can be a disconnect. If you think about things like the typical acoustic ceiling tile, the white panels in the grid that we see, those are very useful. They're very understood acoustically. They were highly engineered. They're affordable. They are workhorses in the acoustics world. They're also a little bit disconnected. They disconnect the visual and the acoustic a little bit, because they try a lot to look like this painted gypsum board wall behind me. They try to look very flat and very minimal. They're not. They are, that system is 15 inches or so deep. That's how it's tested. That airspace matters for the performance, of course. If you were to zoom in, you'd find a highly complex porous surface, even if it looks visually blank. And I think although that works just fine in a lot of cases, I think we are missing out on some experiences, some great design possibilities when we take something like this needs to be complex for the acoustics, but we want it to look visually simple, and we disconnect those two things. And I got a little bit off track from what your point was there, but I think they're connected somehow. In that this experience of you're in a crowd, you're alone, you're in a large space, you're in a small space. I think it can be a very personal experience, and the way we interact with architecture, I feel like it really matters, and that sometimes the difficulties we have in acoustics is that people just haven't been connecting what they're seeing to what they're hearing. Maybe because we rely too heavily on systems like ACT.
Maybe. So okay, let's yeah, no, that's interesting, and I think that there are people who are drawn to the more sort of quieter spaces and those who like the more reverberation. In our conversation here, I was thinking about. I'm sorry, this is called Life with Strings Attached. Everything to me is connected to the guitar somehow, Zackery. But we're going to tie this all together. But my brother-in-law plays guitar where I don't think his reverb is ever turned off on his amplifier, and it's always quite high. Me, on the other side, my amplifier doesn't have reverb. I don't own a reverb solution, actually. And I remember playing where, yeah, people would ask for reverb and delay, and I'd be like, I'm sorry, I don't have that here. But I would have to. The thing is, to me, it meant that I had to be creative in how I approached my instrument. And just because the effect wasn't there, it meant that I had to approach my guitar to give them something what they were asking for. And so in the case of a reverberant delay, it meant that I would have to, play more with my right hand and approach my strings differently and give them a bit of a delayed effect without the effect of a delay. I had to do it personally, with my instrument. And to me, it was always more of a challenge, and I really enjoyed that. So, but the point is, I don't think that my brother-in-law sees a guitar without reverb as a reasonable choice. He wants that,
yeah.
Whereas I want control, and I like definition, and I like clarity, and the reverb mucks that up for me. And so the room will always give me most rooms will give me some level of reverberation, and so I want to control what I can from my side, which is interesting. So one of the topics I really want to dive into you about acoustics is some things that you said, again, in your presentation at the Biennale, was that we've been perhaps careless in acoustic architecture about how we define the word material. And then you went on to say a little too careless in the past, causing us to categorize material too quickly and look right past the potential in them. This really resonated with me because it's exactly what we do in guitar making. As we say, if you want more low frequency, you use rosewood in acoustic guitar. If maple has more attack, mahogany, has warmth, but also a little faster response than rosewood has, and such. And so, but I have been on a bit of a mission against this sort of thinking, which I think you and I are perhaps comrades in our mission here, in the way that we're talking about systems, and that, yes, that material has something to do, of course, with the system response. But actually, in the case of a musical instrument, a lot of the times we're actually misattributing what the response is. So what I see in those scenarios is, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with guitar construction.
Not very.
Yeah, anything? Okay. Yeah. So you know what an acoustic guitar looks like, the hollow wooden boxes, right?
Yeah.
And a typical acoustic guitar, the most typical acoustic guitars would use a thin spruce top on it with a mahogany neck and either rosewood or mahogany bent sides and a thin back on it. Okay? That's the structure of it. And a guitar with a rosewood back and sides typically has more low frequency response than one with mahogany. And we attribute, therefore, rosewood means bass, mahogany doesn't. But actually, the way that I think this works is that it is the rosewood and it's not the rosewood. That the rosewood is a greater resistance because it's more dense and it's more stiff than the mahogany is. And so the energy traveling through the string into the top doesn't leave the top as efficiently because it can't transfer into the rosewood so easily as it does through the spruce. Therefore, the given energy causes the spruce to travel a greater distance because it's not leaving the spruce. We have more amplitude is moving here. And when we change those back and sides to mahogany, it's actually a more efficient energy transfer and it moves out of the top quicker. And so it's actually the top doesn't travel as far, and therefore the frequency increases, and we have less low frequency, right? Because the amplitude, it gives us fewer movements within a second, right? Within a hertz. And so, but interestingly, if you tap on the rosewood by itself, the tap tone is higher than if you tap on the mahogany. And that's because the rosewood is stiffer and denser. We all know that. But we still say rosewood equals bass. But actually what we're doing is, to me, acoustic design within instruments, and it must be the same within structures and spaces, is a matter of creating obstacles or making affordances to direct the energy or the movement where you want it and remove it from parts of the system you don't want it, right? It's obstacles and affordances. Is that a too naive way to look at this?
I think that's just right on. And we do have parallels from the story you just told, which, by the way, thank you for the clear explanation. I'm not a guitar builder, but that made sense to me. I strive for that in acoustics, in architectural acoustics as well, is that we should be able to talk to each other about this and not just within the community of experts. But we have similar things that have come up. We have spaces that are reverberant. They've gotten more so through the 20th century. That's another topic we could get into. It has to do with the precision with which we build and the lack of ornamentation, the stripping away of a lot of the three-dimensional details that we used to have. But we come up with these rules, these approaches. If you want to reduce the reverberation in a space, there are products for that. Let's talk about glass, because if we want to talk about this idea of material and how I think we may have been careless about how we defined it, fiberglass is what you could call a material, and it is well known to be a good absorber of sound. And you can buy fabric wrapped fiberglass panels. They're designed to absorb sound. They've been tested. They are understood. It's a known quantity, and you can relatively easily calculate how much you need and simply add them to your space to reduce the reverberation. On the other hand, glass windows, for example, or glass doors have a reputation in architecture as being acoustically bad, just as being a negative thing. I do talk to a lot of architects. I frequently hear, well, this room has glass, so it's bad, And, but when you dig a little deeper on the idea of material, you can ask, what are those glass walls made of? And what is the fiberglass made of? You can ask what substance these materials are made of. And you find out that they're both glass, that fiberglass is real glass. And of course, so are glass walls. And this is, to me, the point at which so much possibility opens up in design. Because then if we start to ask, why is it that one of these things is, let's say, reverberation promoting and one is reverberation reducing, if they're both made out of the substance glass, and you end up thinking about the shape of it, the complexity of it, and you can realize that there's an entire world, an infinite world of possible shape between a plate of glass and a fiberglass panel. And you're going to get an infinite number of possible acoustic behaviors within that range. And so no one would, but if I had a piece of plate glass and a piece of fiberglass in one hand, no one would argue if I said these are different materials. I think we sometimes look at, like, when we say material, I think we're including something about its structure, something about its form. We see this with everything. PET is a popular acoustic absorber these days. That's a resin, so you can take a resin panel in one hand and a resin felt in another, PET felt, and you could say these are different materials. And for the way that we discuss things, that's perfectly appropriate. But I think where we've been a little bit careless is that we too quickly say one is an acoustic material, one is not. And we don't ask these deeper questions about what substance they're made of. And I think we just miss out on a lot. And the project that I've been working on most recently is these glass panels that it's a collaboration with Katie Newell and Wes McGee, both at the University of Michigan. And we, over the last few years, have essentially taken automobile glass and shaped it, slumped it in a way that we get these different acoustic behaviors out of it. So we take something in its flat form that's known to be acoustically, let's say, reverberation promoting, not necessarily bad. We're able to shape it so that we can get acoustic diffusion, so that we can get acoustic absorption, and something like no one has ever seen before comes out of it because it's a new surface design. And it's really the whole point of that. That piece is not meant to be in any particular location. It's not meant to be added to a wall anywhere. It is more like a piece of sculpture or an architectural surface that demonstrates that glass is not just bad or good, that you can actually get these ranges of behavior out of it. And it all comes from this idea of material, asking what do we mean when we say this is a material, this is an acoustic material, this is not. What do we mean when we call fiberglass one material and plate glass another?
So have you developed new terms? Do you have terms that you wish that your colleagues would use instead?
That's a good question. I don't spend a lot of time wishing that my colleagues did things any differently.
But for your own communications, how do you communicate the difference?
Yeah, I find that with architects, we have a lot of terminology that is already there and is already useful. Architects think in terms of shape a lot. And I think we can talk about acoustics in that realm really without much new language at all. They just need to be brought on board in the same way that we just discussed. Like, we need to clarify what we mean by material, or maybe give it a new definition and say that when I say material, I'm talking about the substance from which things are made. And to point out that the acoustic value or acoustic behavior of something is inherently related to how it's shaped, because that's always not necessarily something that they have been taught. We are taught that polished stone is bad acoustically, but if you were to do a complex enough polished stone sculptural wall, it would absolutely be diffusive, and you could probably even get it to absorb if you did the right things. And I think once we have that common understanding that we're talking about material in a certain way and shape in a certain way, then the design possibilities just really open up.
Have you found historic examples that might reference that ancient cultures understood that in any way? I'm thinking about the ceramic use in China in structures. And do you know of any examples of Chinese architecture where they shaped the ceramic? I'm thinking of ceramics that are made to look like bamboo. But they're columns or their pillar, their wall structures and such, and the material are glazed ceramics. I think, unless I'm just thinking of, embarrassingly, perhaps a Chinese food restaurant or something. I don't know. My knowledge of Chinese architecture and history is woefully inadequate, unfortunately. Well, it wouldn't have to be Chinese, but just anywhere. Marble. There's lots of marble structures and such.
Yeah. I mean, what I've noticed is that when you're in spaces that have more complicated boundaries, they tend to be less reverberant. There's really two aspects. Bigger spaces tend to be more reverberant than smaller spaces, and this is widely known. And then spaces with more complicated boundaries tend to be less reverberant than spaces with less complicated boundaries. The most extreme example of reverberation that I know of is a room called the Maparium in Boston. Have you been inside this room?
I've not. Would like to.
It's a glass globe. Yes. I think it's about 30 feet in diameter, and you can walk out onto a bridge.
Okay.
And you can stand with your head right in the middle of, so you're inside the globe. It's made completely out of stained glass. So it's a sphere. It's a glass sphere.
Yes.
And it is the most extreme example I know of as far as reverberation in a space, but not because it's made out of glass, because it's in the shape of a sphere. And the sphere happens to be the simplest possible enclosure you can dream up. The sphere is the least amount of surface area for any given volume. And so the one term that I may have coined is something called sphericity. This is a term that is used in other fields like geology to assess the age of stones, for example, where stones tend to get more round as they get older and they're kicked around. But I would like to start thinking of architecture spaces in terms of sphericity, where the further the shape of the room gets away from the sphere, the further it gets from the maparium, the less reverberant it gets. And I think this inherently includes a lot of possibilities for architecture. For example, you fill a room with people or furniture or books or whatever it is, you're changing the complexity of the boundaries. You're making it less reverberant. I'm blanking on a particular example of a complicated space, but they are all around us if you go into a bookstore or a library.
A library.
And if you think of not the shape of the room as the room empty, but the shape of the room as inclusive of the shelves and the books themselves. And then you think about the structure of a book when you look at it on end, and it, that you have tiny gaps between the pages and you have the porosity of things, and all the books are different sizes, but they're all human scale. Even large books are the same as us, essentially, and we can manipulate them. And they're all expressions of different creative acts, and they, and so the complexity is immense. The complexity of the boundary of a library or a bookstore is immense, and that is what makes it less reverberant. It really is. If you were to remove all of those books, remove all the complexity, it would get more reverberant. That is not a coincidence.
There's a pop culture moment that you're making me think of here that I wonder if it was completely made up for the film. There's a moment in the third Indiana Jones where they're in a library in Venice, and they realize the catacomb is underneath them, and the information they need is there. And so Harrison Ford, as Indiana Jones, takes this brass pole, and he's gonna smash the marble, but he's trying not to be noticed. And there's a librarian with a stamp who's like taking the stamp, and it's like, and you hear this boom, sort of, and they're like, and he has to do it more than once, right? But the acoustic engineers for the film put a reverberous sort of, because it's a big old library in Venice, and every time you say that libraries are quiet, I'm thinking, oh, is there any reverb in that old library that they showed Indiana Jones or not? I can't get away from it. Not much. I'll be in Venice in a couple of months, and that library exists. I'm going. We'll have a little additive part to this afterwards, and I'll be in the library there, and I'll call you. Do you have WhatsApp? Okay. I'll call you on WhatsApp.
Yes, I do. Sounds great.
And we'll talk about it. That's fantastic. So that's fascinating. I'm going to sideline a little bit here. I can't recommend the book yet because I've only got it because I listened to a podcast recently. But there's a podcast from the Freakonomics series. I don't know if you know Freakonomics at all, but one of the ones they have is called People I Mostly Admire, or PIMA, and they interviewed recently a oh my goodness, I think she's a physicist of some sort. Yes. But she's like one of 10 people in the world who studies bubbles. Oh. And
great. That sounds great.
Yes. And one of the things she studies is the acoustic effects of the bubbles in the water, because there have been acoustic experiments done where they've made a loud noise in one part of the world, and they notified stations around the world to be listening for this. And I think within 2 hours, the sound travels not any part of the ocean, but apparently the ocean is layered, and that there's a layer of the ocean that the whales sort of communicate through. The ocean is distinct layers, thermal differences, flow differences, and such. And if you get into this one particular layer, you can make a noise on one side of the world and hear it on the other side of the world within about 2 hours.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, remarkable. And it's one of the things that it highlights so incredibly well for me is one of the problems I think in the thinking of instrument makers is that we talk a lot of them talk about the acoustic guitar as an air pump, and we think of air often as kind of nothingness. And of course, the air is not nothing. It's just the molecules are far enough apart that we can see through it, mostly, right? But there are times where we see the effects of more water in the air or different chemicals in the air and such, and we can tell that the air is not nothingness. And that the acoustic response, if I understand it well enough, is basically a chain reaction of one molecule hitting the next until it eventually impacts with our eardrum and hits the molecules that exist under tension of some magical force in our ear that moves, and our auditory perceptors translate it into what we call sound. Is that too naive of an understanding?
No, I think that's a fair description.
It, right. And so when we talk about that sort of movement, well, the density of water is so much more than the density of our air that there's just less space in between those molecules, and the efficiency of transfer to move across the planet in 2 hours like that, it actually makes me think that something like teleportation is actually possible. When realize the density of material can allow us to transfer so much faster. And so anyways, I haven't read the book yet. I've ordered it. It's on my shelf. I'm going to get to it once I finish the current book. It's called The Blue Machine. If you're interested in it, I can send you a link to it. But yes, she's studying acoustics of bubbles, and I'm totally interested in having.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty good way to spend your life. Honestly, the acoustics of bubbles.
Yeah,
you could get into that. Yeah,
until you realize that in order to do so, they have to chase after storms and drop sensors into large waves on a boat. She gives this great example of when you're showering on a ship, you don't really have to find the water. The water finds you as you're being tossed from side to side.
Yeah, maybe that's not for me. I think I'll stick with the buildings.
Yeah. So I'll just make a note here to say that the example you talked about with the glass panels, which, if I can describe for a second here, are sort of hexagonal, and they're arranged from left to right. And you described them in a previous presentation as the first section is reflective, and then the shapes become diffusive, and then eventually become absorptive, but all the same material. And if you want to see more about that, we'll put a link in this later on to the Venice, your presentation with the Venice Biennale.
That's great. Yeah, and
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com.
And we also were really intent on making sure that we were able to move through those different types of acoustic behavior with a system. So the system is that you have a kiln, and you put these hexagonal panes that are flat in the kiln. Sometimes you cut holes in them ahead of time. You cut slits in them ahead of time. And then the kiln heats up and the panel sags, and therefore it changes its shape. And so what's really remarkable is that this is all glass, and it's showing these different categories of acoustic behavior. My intent on this is that I think we can look at these categories as all being part of the same spectrum. That if I say a surface is acoustically reflective, or it's acoustically diffusive, or it's acoustically absorptive, or even acoustically transparent, we can define surfaces in that way. You can go buy an acoustic diffuser, you can buy an acoustic reflector, etc. But what we're trying to say with this project is that those are moments on a continuum, and that if you know how to access it, you can do it continuously. And so if you look at that project, you'll see that the panels on the one end look a lot like the panels on the other, except they're just more extreme.
Yeah.
And we're able to so not only with glass, but using a particular system. And I want to also be clear that this is also not what an acoustic surface looks like. This could be anything. Like you can go through this process with any material. You could spend a lifetime exploring the possibilities within glass. I think sometimes if I say acoustic panel, we have an image that shows up in our mind. That's fine, sure. But we should recognize that this is not limited to that. This glass wall is an example of one possibility among infinite possibilities, and I think that's where it can get really exciting for architecture.
I am right with you. That is right up my alley. That's exactly the point of this conversation for me, was to explore these ideas, Zach. And the reason I'm trying to simplify my understanding of sound is to remove limitations. The whole idea is for me to sort of be able to think in a way which opens up possibilities, so that we're not just, less reverberant is box A, more bass response is box C, and it's just, I don't see the world quite that. I'm tempted to say simply, but it's not simple. That's actually more complex than it needs to be. From if I'm right. And so can I roll some concept past you and try and tell you how far I am with my idea of getting as simple as possible on this?
Yeah.
So I think I've got it down to 3 words as far as understanding acoustics, at least in a low resolution, sufficiently useful version. Because we are looking for usefulness. And my context of usefulness is with guitar makers and instrument makers. Although that becomes a broader conversation, which is what things like the Biennale were about for us, was to bring together people from multiple disciplines so that we could all benefit from, what word do you use? Or how do you think of this? In this case, how do you think of materials? How do you think of spaces, right? So I'm dealing with objects, tensioned objects, intentionally tensioned objects. And in a physics sense, a tensioned object is referred to as having potential energy, right? And so we create a system which has potential energy, and that we will then, through kinetics typically, we will perform kinetic energy and set that tensioned object into motion, right? Now that's overly complicated. So my 3 words, which I will break down for a second here, are motion plus time plus perception. And this is the understanding. And let me break that down for a second because, well, you are a physicist and you think about acoustics all the time. But for people who are watching this, from my understanding, not as a physicist, motion and energy within physics basically are the same thing. I'm going to read from the Encyclopedia Britannica for a second, which says that all forms of energy are associated with motion. For example, any given body has kinetic energy if it is in motion. A tension device, such as a bow or a spring, though at rest, has the potential for creating motion. It contains potential energy because of its configuration. Motion, energy, effectively the same thing. Time, as defined by the Oxford Dictionary, a point of time as measured in hours or minutes. So the Hertz, which is how we measure sound, named after the German scientist, I don't remember his first name, last name Hertz. The unit of measure is, it is.
Heinrich, I think it was Heinrich.
Is it Heinrich?
Yeah, I think so.
We'll look it up. We'll get it right. So, Mr. Hertz. And 1 hertz is 1 within a second. 1,000 hertz, a kilohertz is 1,000 within a second. Millihertz, 1,000,000 within a second, right? So this time is how we actually measure and communicate this motion. So, as a matter of fact, the Oxford Dictionary gives this example. The frequency of the A string of a violin is 440 vibrations or cycles per second. It defines that the A string of the violin has 40 points of motion, basically, within the given second and that's how we measure it. So it's motion in time. And the reason I included perception is that perception, again, Encyclopedia Britannica, is the ability to see, hear, or become aware of something through the senses. And once I understood that motion and time, I realized that the only difference between sound and light is the perceiver. It's the eardrum or the eyeball. Because light is also motion measured in time, right? It's a higher frequency is a different color than a low frequency, right? So, sort of standard daylight is somewhere around, depending where you are and what time of year it is, but it's somewhere in the 5,000, 5,600 sort of range, I think. And that's sort of the natural sort of sunlight. But it gets, as we get more frequent, meaning there's less time between the pulses, we have warmer. And as we get less frequent, more space between them, we get colder. Right, and that's how we perceive the light, and it's how we perceive heat as well.
Yeah, I think there is something with color temperature, right, which is like how warm or cool a white light is.
Yes,
and I think you said it right, but the different wavelengths, the different colors they're in a few hundred nanometers essentially, but they go from red to to violet, right? And what the frequency is determines which of those.
So it's still
which of those colors we
motion
see. It's very similar.
Or energy defined or measured by time. Yeah, it's how many waves, how many waves within a given second or hour, however you want to define it. But we do define it by time. That's what we do. And then, so once I went down this path, this is where, once I realized, or I think I realized, that sound and light, the difference was the perception or the receiver. Well, then I thought, are the other five senses, are all five senses this way? And I realized that, yes. I didn't know anything about smell or taste, but smell, as the cheese warms up, it becomes more pungent. And we become more aware of it. When it's colder, it smells different to us. And we heat up food, we taste it differently than we do. And so I didn't understand taste, but honestly on Instagram I was pitched a noodle bowl that is electric. And it's for people who have too high sodium in their system. And so they charge your noodle bowl with current or chopsticks. And when you taste them, because now the molecules are moving at a higher frequency, you perceive it as more salt.
Interesting.
Which sounds like ridiculous voodoo magic, except for the fact that we can now tie all of these together. And so the last part I'll say about sound and why I think perception is important is because I was recently in a conversation where cochlear implants came up, and one of the other panelists, their wife was a neuroscientist who did work on cochlear implants. And he said that they found in their studies that people with cochlear implants could hear, perceive lower frequencies and higher frequencies than those of us functioning with eardrums. Because the cochlear implant bypasses the eardrum altogether and goes directly to the auditory sensors, which tells me that the eardrum is then an effective filter. We know our eyeballs are the same way. We don't see UV light. Fish do, right? And so the perceiver. So again, motion plus time plus perception. And once I understand this, now I can approach the things that we do differently. And so when I go back to that scenario I explained with an acoustic guitar with the rosewood sides, or if let's say I have a mahogany guitar and I want more bass response, more low frequency, the traditional response would be, well, you should make that with rosewood, or you should make a bigger body. But now I see it as I need to figure out how to insert more time. And inserting more time can be thinning the membrane at the top so that the same given amount of energy causes it to go further. greater amplitude. And because it has greater amplitude, it takes more time to go from here to here. I can lengthen the grain, because a short grain has a shorter response, but given the same density and thickness and size, if I lengthen the grain, I will get more low frequency, higher frequency by shortening the grain. This is a great example is a marimba or a xylophone. They're the same thickness, width, but the bars are longer and shorter, and that's what changes the frequency of these, right? A church organ pipe, this is different because now we're dealing with air volume. Because with the air volume, what we're doing is we're making it inefficient for the air volume to leave the pipe. And by doing so, we're inserting time. If we want a higher frequency, we find a way to get the air out faster. And that's what happens with a shorter pipe or a flute. The highest notes on the flute are the ones closest to the source. And if we want a lower frequency, we retain it longer by inserting time. Does that make sense from an acoustician?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I have a more absolute. I think that you're expanding the definition of time a little bit, and I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I have a bit of a more absolute perception of time or understanding of time, I would say. But to me, it all really comes down to motion. I've been thinking about time for a long time, and it still is difficult for me to think of it as something that is really a thing. It feels sometimes like time is really just the result of motion, or it's a way to describe motion. Yes. When I think about, and I find that the ability to play with that and expand it, speed it up is really helpful in acoustics. One of the tools that I've been using for more than a decade, and I go back to all the time, are visual simulations, wave-based simulations, so that you can see how sound propagates in a space and how it interacts with a particular surface or shape. And those are most informative to me when I slow them down greatly and I can watch how sound interacts, even though our perception is going to be absolutely depend on how it happens real time. The ability to modify that and slow it down is really useful. But I feel like it's the slowing down of the process of the energy and the motion, and time is just a thing that kind of falls out of that.
It's a measurement, though. I mean, a centimeter, an inch, a kilometer, these are all just constructs so that we agree on what the space is, that we measure it. And the only reason that time is necessary is because we're saying that how many waves there are within this given agreed upon distance.
Right.
And that's how we measure it and communicate it. And without that concept of time, then how do we talk about the difference, which is frequency?
No, you're right. I don't think there's any way you can. Time is necessary for that.
That's why this idea of resolving the complexity is how it's a matter of removing things. You know, when Brancusi would make sculptures, he would make it with a bit of ear, and then he would take and say, "Do we need ear to communicate woman or not?" And he'd remove ear and say, "I can still shape and convey a feminine form without ear." You know, and so it's this reductive process, and so. So far, I can't get rid of time in the equation. Maybe you can, but
I don't think you can. I don't. I think ultimately it is a very real thing, but it's very beneficial to be able to, I guess, think of it in terms of motion and energy, because those are the things we're ultimately trying to control, and being able to zoom into time in a sense, slow it down. Yes. So that we can understand the things that are happening faster than we can perceive them is very valuable.
Yeah, the hole in the acoustic guitar, when we change the size of that aperture, we change what we call the resonant value or the fundamental pitch of that acoustic guitar. But everyone just makes it 4 inches because that's what everyone did. And so the reason that I think that this is useful in our context is that when someone says, this to me, I would like some more, I'm going to just keep on harping on low frequency for the moment, so that we can benefit from the other examples. If we want more low frequency, I would say the automatic response isn't rosewood. You can lengthen the string to a greater scale length. You have to get to a tension still to meet that same note. But you can lengthen what's happening and you will get more low frequency. The gauge of the string could be thicker, more mass also in this way.
Right.
It will cause a greater sort of movement again. You can close that aperture because the closing of the aperture causes the pitch to go down. And it causes it to go down because we're actually making it less efficient for the air volume to leave. When we open it up, the pitch goes up. And this is a real way to tune an instrument, but people don't do it. And so we could lengthen the body. We could change the aperture. We could change the gauge of the strings. We could create more mass on the bridge so that the given energy causes a greater amplitude because we have the benefit then of not inertia, momentum, with a little more mass there. Of course, there's a point where it loses the energy to come back up, right? So you have to find an equilibrium there. But so within my context, what I'm hoping to do is if you stop thinking about this as bass or treble or mid-range in a sound sense, and we start to think about it as, I need to insert time or I need to remove time from this scenario. Then you can think about how can I make this part of the system more efficient? So I'm making an affordance. I'm removing an obstacle. Or how can I make this part of the system less efficient because I want the energy to move through this area more quickly. Yeah. And so that's the reason I'm trying to get there. Is that maybe not useful within your context?
No, I think it is. I think it's a different way of thinking that is opening up possibility as opposed to the standard ways of doing these, right? In the guitar world, it sounds like there are a lot of parallels. If you want a particular thing to happen, you have a choice maybe of one or two ways that is done. And you're thinking about it in a deeper way that allows you to find out what more is possible. And I do think that's relevant to the work that I'm trying to do and to architecture in general. I get a very good response to architects. Once we're talking about form and material, they get excited about acoustics. They generally are not always, but they are generally not very excited if I am talking about the standard methods and approaches of acoustic design or acoustic engineering, acoustic consulting. Those are fine ways to solve that, but they don't get into the thing that seems to be very important to architects, which is this creative act. When they don't have possibility in front of them, they are of course less interested. And so I think this is a place where so much good architecture can emerge, is this, that we go down to this fundamental level, even sometimes at the risk of oversimplifying it, right? I mean, that's one of the things that I think if a criticism was lobbed in my direction for how I approach things, I could be accused of oversimplifying things sometimes. But it is in search of these connecting moments with the architect. How do we have a shared language? We do not necessarily need them to go get a master's degree in acoustics in order to talk with us. But we need to find the elements of where the elements of what we're doing overlap with the elements of what they're doing, if possible. Yes. I think that I feel like there's a parallel there to how you're thinking about this. You're going deeper, you're going more simple so that you can then expand outward and ask what's possible there. That's absolutely what I'm trying to do as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I see a great future for what you're doing. To me, the problem with architecture, with architects here, would be that you're going to alter their form afterwards, and they don't know how you're going to do it. And as a creative,
I'd much rather be involved in the process so that you don't come along and fuck up my beautiful clean lines, Right?
Exactly. Exactly. And I would much
Yeah.
rather have I mean, I also have an interest in stepping outside of the realm of consultant and doing more design work, because when you think about acoustics in this way, I can't help but also want to be designing. I did want to be an architect, and I got sidetracked, let's say, and
Yeah.
permanently sidetracked. But I think there can be a mutual respect there. I want architects to have control over their designs. It is painful for me to have to come in and recommend that they add a bunch of stuff that they don't want in their space. And the way to prevent that is to help them intuitively understand why what the results are going to be from the decisions that they're making in the process. I think there's a lot of space for everyone in that.
Yeah.
And if we can talk about we start with the material. If you want to work in stone, you want to work in concrete, you want to work in wood, you want to work in objects, you want to work in textiles, mixtures of all of those. We can have an understanding of the influence of those things acoustically, so that the architect can really guide this in the same way they're doing visually, in the same way that they're thinking about the experience of the space from a visual standpoint. The acoustics also comes along with. And it is pretty shocking how much of the design community, at least in the United States, that's where most of my experience is, thinks of acoustics as the presence or absence of acoustic products. They do not think of acoustics as the result of the materials and shape of the room. They tend to think of it as, did I buy acoustics or not? And that, of course, does not lead to great design.
Yeah, that sounds awful. So,
I should also maybe also mention that I'm not anti-product either. I actually work with I work with a couple of great product manufacturers. The really nice thing is that those are like engineered to have a lot of influence, and so they absolutely have their place. And as those product manufacturers design more visually, they naturally become more of the intentional design of the room. So that has its place as well. But we absolutely need to get past this thought that acoustics is about products or no products, because that's where, that is where the possibility really lies. When an architect is designing something and they can think in terms of, okay, this has a complex shape, so it's going to help acoustically. And maybe I'll go with something a little more minimal over here. Maybe, you can really compose the shape of the space for sound.
yes. And that is, given that we have second here, given that we're talking more and more about user experience, user interface. No, I was asked to come and speak. Are you hearing me okay?
It's starting to get weird. I'm keeping up, but there's like an echo that's showing up and some static.
Okay, I was just giving us a technical question.
I don't know if that's. Can you hear me? Okay. Or?
I can. Yeah, I can.
We're going to go ahead and hope the recording on this works out fine. But so I was asked to come and give a presentation at an interaction design class in the university in Toronto. And interaction design is this cross-disciplinary course where they bring together interior designers, architects, psychology majors, all these different disciplines to design the human experience with things that any human would interact in a space with an object or an experience. And to me, you've got to be on the cutting edge of this, Zach. You've got to be on the cutting edge of this because we're talking about interaction design. We're talking about how humans feel and interact within a space. And so I see huge possibilities for the work that you're doing. And I think that the younger students who are coming up through the programs right now, they're going to be ready to receive your message, and they're going to want to do that right from the beginning.
I appreciate that. That's excellent to hear. I appreciate the support and and letting me talk about this. I think they're exciting ideas as well. That's what's drawing me to it. So, yeah.
Well, I'm conscious of your time here. We must be running out at this point. So thank you so much for taking your time today. I hope it's not our last conversation, because I would love to continue on at some point.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's keep going deeper. Absolutely. Would love to continue talking about it. And yeah, thanks again for having me.
Yeah. You're welcome. And, this is a new podcast at this point in time. I think you're the fourth person interviewed at this point. We haven't released anything yet. It's all coming. But Life with Strings Attached is part of my work is as the guitar as an icon of contemporary culture that has exceeded the bounds of its utility. I've been working with that phrase now for a couple of decades. And the guitar continues to somehow get me into situations where I kind of have no business being. I don't know why. At the Venice Biennale, I had architecture friends that I told that was Biennale, and they're like, "How the fuck did you get invited to the Biennale?"
The Biennale?
Yeah. I went to the right school. I did the right things. I've never been invited. Aren't you a guitar guy? And I've had opportunities to be on AI think tanks, and I've worked a little bit with the United Nations and all sorts of different things that, for some reason, my working in the guitar has just given me these sometimes loose connections, sometimes very obvious connections. But I'm kind of running this on sort of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, if you will. You know that? We're somehow all connected, and that, you and I are connected through Ed Keller,
because of
who I'm connected with because of guitar, and Sophia, the first robotic citizen of the world, and the idea of Sophia learning to play guitar and my work on the icon of the guitar brought me there, which brought me to you. And I'm really thankful for it, because, we are related. We're both working within acoustics. You're working within built environments. I'm working with built objects.
But I also curate spaces. And so I would actually love for you and I to have a different conversation about the fact that I curate a part of the largest musical instrument show in the world, which I'm sure it won't take you long to realize we have some acoustic issues that we could resolve. And so, let's stay in touch on this, because maybe, the space that I designed at the NAMM show, we could work on together and do something really interesting within an extremely challenging acoustic environment. Yeah. All right. So, Zach, in closing, is there any closing words that you have to say, or anything that you want people to know, where to find you, or projects you want them to see that we can direct them towards? Or?
Well, I would say that if anyone is interested in the conceptual underpinnings of what we're talking about, I do have an essay called Acoustic Ornament that I wrote a couple of years ago. And I have a few physical copies available. I also have the digital copies are free, so maybe we can give a link to that. Anyone who's interested in acoustics and architecture in general, and what sort of possibilities this kind of thinking might lead to.
Wonderful. We will include that link there, so make sure you get that to us afterwards, and we'll do that.
We'll do.
And so, again, thank you very much. It's been great. Thanks for being a part of A Life with Strings Attached, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Right.
I do too.
We'll say goodbye for now. All right, ciao. Thank you for watching and listening. You can find more episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts, and a special thanks to those who support us on Patreon. It's your support that enables us to do this work.